We are so glad to have you with us today. We're going to let folks keep making their way in from the waiting room, and we will get started momentarily. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, Communicating Climate Change, Insights from Meteorologist Keith Carson. Keith needs no introduction. Whether you know him from the Weather Channel, from News Center Maine, or from social media, Keith Carson is a household name. He is also one of Maine's most trusted voices in climate communication. With more than a decade of experience in making complex weather and climate information accessible and engaging, he's learned what works and what doesn't when it comes to shifting opinions on climate issues. We are so excited to welcome you today, Keith, and we can't wait to hear all of your tips for engaging the public on climate topics in a way that resonates without overwhelming. Thank you for being with us. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate. And MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. A few notes before we dive in. We will hear from Keith first and then tackle your questions in the Q&A following the presentation. You don't have to wait, though. You can send your questions to me or to Maggie Summers through the chat whenever they occur to you. We'll synthesize them and ask as many as possible in that Q&A. If you have any technical difficulties, Maggie Summers is the one to help you out. Just send her a message through the chat and she will work her magic. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You can also find it on YouTube, where there are a whole bunch of playlists that help you focus in on particular topics. Thank you again for joining us, and Keith, the floor is yours. Oh, and we're having that audio glitch again. We're having a little challenge during our tech check, but.
Okay, how are we now? We sound better
great.
now?
Perfect.
Okay, now everyone in my newsroom can hear everyone. So just think about that now that I don't have headphones. Okay, all right. So thank you for the introduction. I think my best use in these scenarios is to talk about how people react to different climate messaging. There's a lot of great scientists out there that you can learn the ins and outs of every little trend that we have in Maine and across the country as far as climate change, and that is interesting stuff. I think I am better used talking about, hey, here's the messaging that I see, and here's the feedback that I get about different attempts, because we get a lot of feedback, right, when we run different climate stories. And so I'm going to put you through a little presentation here is what I've learned about, what kind of climate change communication works and what doesn't seem to work as well. And that's been something that I've been experimenting with over the years, and trying different methods to see what works. And obviously this specifically applies to my work here in Maine, but I feel like when I've talked to other meteorologists that do climate change work, it seems to apply to other places as well. So we're going to start by talking about who's reachable on climate change messaging and who maybe is not the right person to try to spend too much time on. So hold on one moment. We will share this, and I will start by talking to you about what I think works pretty well. First, let me get some people off my screen here, as much as you guys look great. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the kind of the players, the people that you might encounter if you were to put them into different groups. On the top left-hand side, you have alarmed. There's people, I would assume some of people in this meeting right now fall into that category, where this is a really big issue. You understand what it means for the future, and even really for what's going on right now, and you want to do everything you can to help fix that problem. To the right of that, you have on board, which means people who don't doubt the science of it. They believe that climate change is happening, that is man-made, but honestly, it's just not top of mind for them. They've got other stuff going on. Maybe they're the kind of person who is going to be more focused on the now, or it's just where life is at, where it's just not a huge issue for them. And you'll see some of this when it comes to how different, you see polling on this, right? Like, how important is this to you? And so this is the person who they're not, thank you. They're not saying that they disagree with it or they want to argue it, but it's not the top issue for them. On the right top here is the person you can kind of reach. And so it's the person who's really just not that engaged in this topic one way or another. Okay, so they truly think this is still really up for debate in the scientific community. Because there's a lot of messaging that's been done about, well, science is never settled. And we'll talk about that in a minute. There is some truth to that. It's being misapplied here, or purposely misapplied here. But this is the person I've had most success with, which is someone who they may seem to have an opinion a little bit, but it's not super well informed or researched or dug in. So that's kind of the person you're trying to reach in these scenarios. The bottom left, climate denier is a word they don't like, but you reach a point where it is what it is. So this is someone who actually spends time trying to find a counter argument. And there are a lot of people like this, at least that I've run into, especially online, who will spend a lot of time, and honestly, they'll get pretty into science to try to get where they want to get, which is that this is not a thing, the data is bad, there's some reason for this. And so this is a group that is probably coming at it from a confirmation bias spot, right? They're going to Google how we know climate change is a hoax or something like that, and then they'll do some work from there. This group is going to be hard because you could throw quite a bit of science at them, but how often do you walk into a room and then say, yep, I changed my mind, and leave? I mean, that's kind of what you're asking people to do here. And then the bottom right is, it seems like similar, but it's actually a different group. It's people who think everything's kind of a conspiracy. So like a lot of times the denier type is really only interested in climate change. They're not going to talk about almost any other kind of science, which I will point out to them seems kind of odd, that they're very into science just in one particular spot. But the conspiracy theorist is more that they don't trust anything that kind of is mainstream. So that's a group that's really not about climate change, just about not trusting the system, so to speak. And so there's all kinds of directions there. Again, tough person. So the top right is your best chance. And then the denier, it depends how you encounter them. In person, you've got a lot better chance of moving the needle. Online or any version of that, you're probably going to be spinning your wheels a little bit. So what are the talking points? The good news is, since I've started this, there's been a retreat about what climate deniers are saying. So when I first started, it was really that we're not warming. I was hearing that pretty consistently. The data isn't very good. It doesn't go back far enough. Ocean temperature sensors aren't good enough. I haven't heard that much lately. I think, if you live almost anywhere in the world, you have encountered obvious, visible warming. And so I don't hear that as much. What I hear more now is that, yes, the climate is changing, but it's a natural cycle. And that is most often what I'm running into for people who don't want to do anything about it or are still being skeptical about it is, yes, the climate has changed before. Tell me how it's different. And we'll discuss that in a second. And related to that are the other points under here, which is, yes, the climate's changing, but it's the sun or it's volcanoes, which often people will get volcanoes the wrong way directionally. I've heard a lot of people say, well, look how much CO2 a volcano can put into the atmosphere. In reality, most big volcano eruptions, of course, are a cooling effect on the Earth because of all the other particulates that it puts into the atmosphere. Either way. And the other is kind of like a feelings argument. People have talked to me about how, CO2 is such a small part of the atmosphere. So how could it have such a big impact on the climate? It's not a main, it's not the main ingredient in our atmosphere. And I think the easiest way to talk about that is to talk about what greenhouse gases are, right? Like if we didn't have greenhouse gases, how would the planet look for us? They're not a huge percentage of the atmosphere, but they have a huge impact. And so you get down to the bottom of this. And the other thing that you'll hear people talk about is, I'm not supposed to believe science hook, line, and sinker. Part of science is being skeptical. And that's true. Crucially, it's people who are qualified to do research in a particular field that are supposed to be the ones being skeptical. And I think that's getting a little bit mucky. And that goes back to settled science too. I agree. I think there's very little science that's truly settled, right? I mean, one of the good examples of that is how gravity is still considered a theory. At some point, you move forward with, hey, this is accurate. But I think a lot of people will say there's nothing wrong with being a climate skeptic. That's how science is. And I don't disagree with that, but I don't think it's the job of someone who doesn't have any background in the field to be that person. It's supposed to be other atmospheric scientists and climatologists who publish peer-reviewed research papers that could be a counterpoint to something. That's how it's supposed to work. That's how it does work, right? There are papers out there like that. And so ultimately, these are the talking points that I run into. So approaches. And I figured this out the hard way. I think scary stuff doesn't, and this is going to be maybe a little counterintuitive to a lot of people, because I see a lot of climate campaigns run off of all the bad things that could and are happening. The problem with this is, one is that you're beating a drum so loudly all the time that people just do this. And I think that's true with a lot of different messaging. You think about maybe some of the challenges we had even in COVID messaging. It's people just said enough. I don't want to think about this anymore. And I think this scary stuff with climate change doesn't mean you can't talk about consequences, but the idea that this is kind of, it's gonna, people aren't gonna survive this, whatever the case may be, I find it doesn't work that well. And it also seems like people will actively push back against that quite a bit. Again, doesn't mean you can't talk about what sea level rise is going to look like, but as far as just the doom and gloom, as I call it, I've never found it to be that good. The other reason for that is the middle point, where it says we're past the point of no return. There's been a lot of coverage about, what's the tipping point for the degrees Celsius that we're going to reach here, and maybe we've already reached it. And that's fair science to put out there. However, what does it tell? Tells people that it's too late anyways. And so it makes it, to me, it de-incentivizes action, because I'm trying to think of a good, a good analogy would be like if my boss came in here today before I was on at 5 and said, you're fired. Well, okay, so I'll just let out a bunch of expletives on TV at this point. Who cares? I mean, it's kind of, it's in that ballpark, right? You have to give people hope that they can help this problem. And if not, then why are they going to make maybe potentially some sacrifices for something that has already, it's too late. And so that's why I think the scary stuff is a little tough. In person, and this works with a lot of debates of any kind that you might have, is kind of letting people walk in to their own trap. And so an example is, and I would go to talk to clubs about weather, and then I would surprise them with the climate change talk, because I think sometimes you reach more people that aren't going to show up to the climate change talk by surprising them. And so I learned that one of the things is don't put all your cards out there right off the bat, because they'll just find a sideways around it. And so an example of that is this hypothetical conversation here where people say, okay, it's just a natural cycle. And then you say, okay, well, what do you think is the driver? And often most people will say the sun or some variation of that. And so then you could say, okay, well, we track how much energy comes from the sun. And here's a chart of it. And note that in some cases it has decreased. And so how does that explain it? Or how can the stratosphere above us be cooling? Well, the troposphere, where we live and all our weather is warming. The sun is going through the stratosphere to get the troposphere. How does that work? How does that make sense? And so I think sometimes it's good to let people tell you what they think, and then you can try to gently correct that, as opposed to if you throw that out right away, then I found they'll find another way around to that spot. So again, remember and be honest with yourself about when the last time you had a strong opinion on something, and then somebody talked to you for 10 minutes and you changed your mind. And so we expect that of people, yet if we look at ourselves, we realize maybe we're not very good at that either. And so give people that kind of room, which we'll talk about that in a second, but give people room to absorb some new information and not feel like they're caving to the whole thing all at once. Related to this, we'll get to that actually. So future tense is another thing I avoid. Ironic, given this is my job, but I think the more you talk about climate change models, some of which have had some pretty good success, the more people will correlate that to weather forecasting, which has gotten very good over time, but let's be honest, sometimes it's wrong. And that, I think the more we talk about, hey, we're projected to be, at this temperature this year, and sea level in Miami is projected to be this level, because it's a very complex system. And some of the climate models have been good, but others haven't been good. And some of it has to do with teleconnections like El Nino and La Nina, and things that, on a 30-year scale will even out, but they will change where certain projections land. And so I think I've tended to mostly talk about what's already happened. Whenever I give a presentation on climate change, I show historical temperature records. I show historical CO2 levels. I don't show what I think the king tide in Miami is going to look like in 10 years. Because I think, again, people recognize there's some error there. And so I think it feels like, well, if they're just saying it's going to be like this, then who knows, we'll see, as opposed to here's what's happened so far based on this forming, and we know it is concrete and it's data, it's not a projection. So I think there's some value to that, because people think, like I said, when they think future, stocks, tough to predict, sports, punditry and weather, those are future tense things. And so they have value in the scientific community, a lot of these models, and they tune them, but I'm skeptical of using them in a public application to talk to people about climate change. And this point is what we were kind of just talking about, which is this is the person to person aspect of it. You're not gonna, nobody wants to just be wrong. Like that's not, it's not in our nature. And if you're like that, good for you. It's a very small percentage. I went into this field. I was a degreed meteorologist. I'm not going to say the year I graduated because I didn't want to do any backwards math. But I got out of school and I was working at a company, a forecasting company, where there was a very smart meteorologist who's now pretty prominent in the climate change denial space, and he was a mentor of mine. And so, long story short, for a year or 2 years, I was pretty skeptical of climate change or man-made climate change. And although I learned a lot, obviously in college, getting a degree in atmospheric science, we actually did not cover climate change that much. This is a little while ago, not to be specific, but it wasn't as much of a topic. So I had to change my mind on this this whole thing. And for me, the way it happened was it was just being under the influence of this very smart climate change skeptic. When you're very young, it can have a lot of impact. I started changing it for myself just by reading all the papers, not all of them, but a lot of them by myself. And then I just kind of was like, this guy's bending over backwards to make this go away. And so I had to change. The first climate change talk I ever gave was at Emerson College, and it was on how it might not be man-made. So you can change people's minds, but it wasn't from one person walking in and telling me some information. It was a gradual process. And so when you communicate with people about it, your goal should be to just put a little bit of doubt in their current opinion. Just like crack the door just a little bit, and then see if they'll do a little bit more on their own. And so when I talk to people, these quotes I have here are just an example of that. Like, hey, most people don't realize this, but we know for sure it's not the sun. Here's how. And gauging the person, how much do they want to learn about this? If people really want to get in depth, I have a good video that's on YouTube that's basically 4.5 minutes or 5 minutes, whatever it is. And it's all the main reasons we know that it's us. And I've had people say that they like it because they can just share it to someone. It's pretty straightforward, but it's also technical enough that you might have a pause of maybe people have thought of this. The middle one's really important right now. And this is where your group's going to differ from what my priorities are and can be working in a news organization. Is I often tell people, I'm really not telling you what to do here about this. There are suggestions. We've done stories on electric vehicles and whatnot, but ultimately my goal is to have you understand there is a problem. And then I'm going to leave it up to you and to policymakers to figure out the best way out of this. And I think that's important, at least for me, to remove myself from what's going to happen, because that all of a sudden becomes political, right? So to me, it's like, I'm telling you what's happening, and the solutions are what you should be arguing about at the state and national level. We should not be arguing about whether or not it's a problem and we're doing it. So let's get past that first part. And there's a meteorologist in North Carolina, Brad Pankovich is his name, and he had a quote that I really liked, and I'm going to butcher it, but I'm paraphrasing it. More or less, just because you don't like the solution doesn't mean you can deny the problem. You might not like welfare, but don't tell me poverty doesn't exist. So that's kind of what we're trying to get to here, is like, let's talk about what we know with high confidence, and then how we want to deal with it, what we're willing to do to fix it, is something that really is settled on the political level or the corporate level. And so I think a little separation there could really help. And it's hard to do because you want to go all the way to this you can do, but I think it gives you a little bit more room to reach people. And the last point there is just simply, like climate change, talking about climate change being left or right, to me is myopic and arrogant in the sense that we're not a big part of this world, population wise, land mass wise. And the idea that there's some sort of data fudging going on for one political party in one country and the rest of the world is on board with it is kind of wild. And to be clear, when I say on board, I'm not saying that all countries are doing a good job reducing emissions, because they're not. And but there's not a lot of argument going on about at the international level that this is a problem and this is man-made. And so to hear about, well, it's probably the left cares about or the right cares about, or that it seems, like I said, it's a very self-absorbed in a way, because there's a lot more people and all these other countries are doing, most of them are doing something, whether or not they're doing it fast enough. So it would be such an incredible conspiracy. And I don't believe that we have it in us. I don't think that the world is organized enough to do that kind of thing. And so trying to zoom out a little, so let's not make this about, a political figure you don't like or you do like, and just look at the whole international stage. And that's another point, is it is important to be realistic about what we're doing in the United States and what other countries are doing. And so China has become a scapegoat in recent years. And the reality of it is they are putting out a lot of carbon. They have a lot of people too. But I think to deny that is not fair. We could do better. We could do faster. We have, though, in the United States, been cutting our carbon emissions at a pretty good clip, regardless of political party, actually. We kept it going down for a while. And some other countries, India, China, have not done as well. And I think that's something you have to be fair about too, and say, yeah, that's true. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. I try to appeal to people's American exceptionalism, which is, let's lead the way. Let's be a country that people want to follow. And that's what we want to be. And that's what we have been in a lot of other theaters. So I don't think that we have to wait for other countries. Like, when have we followed? I've said this to people before. When have we waited for Saudi Arabia and India to do something before we want to do it? Like, they should be following us. And so that's a good way, I think, to talk to people and say, we want to lead the way on this topic. One more thing, and then we're going to have some questions, and those are always entertaining. So along the lines of how to talk to people, I found there's a lot I've learned about speaking to people about electric vehicles. And it's kind of the same thing. People don't want to be forced to do something. And I think it's meant well. Different states and have said, okay, we're going to go all electric by a certain time. And I appreciate the goal, although I wonder if it's a little optimistic based on infrastructure I've seen. But the point is, people don't want to be told they have to do something. And so I've owned now 2 electric vehicles, not concurrently, but I had one, I just got a new one. I think they're a great product. I think they will take over fairly naturally. I think it's good to incentivize them. The rebates that people get are really helpful because the cost of batteries is so high. My wife and I will move our gas car to get to the EV quite often. And so I think it's a good product. I think it will naturally win the market. Again, subsidizing is okay. I think telling people they've got to do it by 2030. My 6-year-old doesn't like this either. It makes them not want to do it. And so that's something I've just learned, is like, let's rest on what these really do well. And they do a lot of things really well, and let people drive them when they can and get the price point down a bit, for people. And then I think much like the first time I saw a plasma TV, and I was like, well, the other TVs are dead. Like, there's no way. But it took 10 years. I mean, it wasn't like nobody had a plasma when I first saw them. They were $10,000. So just let the technology speak for itself. And I think forcing people or implying that they have to by a certain time is actually oddly counterproductive. So that's what I've got. Now I'm interested to see what you have for questions. Let me.
Thank you so much. Oh, that is, I really appreciate all of your stories and insights. And we do have a ton of good questions. Folks can keep sending those to Maggie or to me. Uh, but before we transition into that point, just want to remind everyone that later this afternoon, you will get a follow-up email with a link to this recording. Share it far and wide. And also a few tips about thinking about how you talk about climate based on some of the things that we've talked about today. And how can you implement some of what you learned in your conversations around the dinner table, around town, as you go out into the world this weekend. And we'll also throw in a few links. So if you're not already following Keith on social media, you should be. So we'll make that easy for you. Um, let's dive in. And Keith, you're an icon. We want to know more about you behind the scenes. So we're going to start with, you shared a little bit about you haven't always been a climate action advocate. Tell us more about that origin story. How did you go from the mentor who's a lead climate denier to where you are today, to keynoting climate conferences? That's it. That's a story.
Yeah. Thank you. It's interesting. Yeah. It's, you know what? So first of all, what's interesting is I was afraid to tell that story until a couple of years ago because um, as a degree meteorologist, it's like a little embarrassing. And when I run into other degreed Mets that are skeptical, I think there's room for that. But I'm always like, how do you do it? How do you find a way? So I think for me, um, getting under the kind of getting out the wing of this experienced and he was a smart guy, and that's what threw me off about it, honestly, is and because you can have a bad take and be smart. It's not a one-to-one thing. But again, for me, I think it was you can go on and you can pull a lot of these different studies. So I started with some wider view ones, even if you just look at the UN climate report, and it has a lot in it um, that you can link to. And I guess I just started looking at what's the phrase where is it Occam's razor, where it's like the simplest, most obvious solution is often the right one. I think that's where I was landing with it. Is when I was reading all this data, it's again, we could eliminate the sun. We actually do something with carbon isotopes, which so basically you got a bunch of CO2 in the atmosphere, right? But it's not all the same isotopes. So you've got different types of carbon. And there's a certain kind of carbon, I want to say it's either C13 or C14. That's fossil fuel carbon. So it's a type of carbon that only develops underground over a long period of time. So when we burn fossil fuels, it goes back up in the atmosphere. And so scientists have measured over the years the ratio of different isotopes and found that the fossil fuel isotope has taken over because we're burning it and sticking in the atmosphere. And so I think the short version of this long story is it was harder to find a way around it than it was to just see all of the science in front of us. And I think one of the things that I've talked to people about is, in my opinion, if you're going to say that humans burning fossil fuels, adding CO2 into the atmosphere doesn't warm us, then you basically have to go backwards and prove to me that greenhouse gases aren't a thing. Because if you accept that they are, and that's how we are able to kind of sustain our life here on Earth, then adding more of it will make us warmer. You can make it as complicated as you want, but it's not really that complicated. And there are other times in climate history we have warmed, but we know why that is. And we didn't do it at the rate that we're doing this. And so I think it was just a matter of looking at different research, different reports, and saying, well, this guy's working really hard to try to get somewhere. And that's never a good feeling in science, to go in and say, I'm starting here, which is, I think it's unreal. What can I do to chip away at this?
That is so interesting. And there are a couple of things I want to just drill down on that you said there. The first is that you can be smart and have a bad take. And that feels kind of quietly revolutionary because I think a lot of us are guilty of assuming folks who disagree with us, right, who see things in a different way. Well, gosh, that's dumb, right? And gosh, you must be dumb. And just say a little bit more about that because I'm guessing, and maybe this is the second thing to go further on is what is the world of meteorologists? I really hope that you have a lively club of, tell me about like, are most meteorologists where you are? Is it still division? Say more.
Yeah, so it's improved. So the AMS, American Meteorological Society, it's a bunch of nerds like us. Um, they take they take a survey every year about specifically broadcast meteorologists and where they stand on climate change. And when I started, it was more or less 50-50. And at this point, I think of the last check, it was something like 20% were still um, skeptical. I think this is just a certain amount of that that's going to be hard to get all the way out. Now, the deeper into research you get, the fewer of those you have. So, research meteorologists, certainly full time climatologists, that's where you're getting those 97% numbers from, is because the more you get into it, the more you realize this is what it is. TV meteorology is as nerdy or not nerdy as you want it to be. There's a lot of really great scientists who are on TV, and then there's a lot of people who are on TV and they do the weather, and so there's a difference. We of course only hire the real scientists, but in general there's a difference, and there's some division in that as to whether they were hosts first, especially in markets without a lot of weather. Maine, you're hard pressed to have someone who didn't know what they were doing. There are markets out there where you can just be a good TV personality and be a on-air weathercaster. So the long story short is most of them are on board, especially those that are fully degreed meteorologists. That's another subtle thing you'll notice is like, if they're going to be called meteorologists on TV, they have to have a degree. They can be a weather presenter, weather forecaster. That generally means that they don't have one. And there's some good ones out there. I mean, I point out often that Al Roker didn't have a degree in meteorology, but he knows weather now. I mean, he's been doing it a long time. So I think we're going in the right direction with that. Are we going to get to 100? Probably not. And I think that's okay. I think we're oddly important because we're like the front line in this whole thing.
Yeah, and you probably hear from viewers in a way that, that I love this Lunch and Learn series. I love this wonderful crowd. People just don't come to the Lunch and Learns if they're not interested, but they're going to watch the news no matter what, right? They're going to watch the weather. And I'm curious, what have you heard from viewers? And then zooming back a little bit, what does the network have to say about this? Or what, and I'm not asking you to talk about your boss, but like, what is that sort of, how do you position something that is science, but also controversy, but also public? You're doing a lot of things there.
Yeah, it is hard. I think it's an opportunity because of what you just said, which is you're reaching people who don't really want to hear about it. As a result of that, you need to be careful about how much you hit them with it. And so that's one thing I've learned is, if you hammer people about it, I mean, I think there are people who are dug in enough about this that they'll be like, I'm watching someone else. I don't want to deal with this. And there's a certain percentage of that probably happens. I try to take moments where it's pertinent to talk about it. And I often don't belabor it. Like we just came off our second warmest summer, okay. And I showed a chart of most of these were in the last 10 or 15 years. And often, sometimes I'll make a joke of it. Like I'll be like, I don't know, do you guys see a trend there? And then you walk off camera, go back and chit chat about it. Just little, if you can just put little nuggets in there, I think it's good. So you don't turn people away from it, as opposed to making it like a main part of your presentation. Then you're probably going to get down to this point where it's like almost like cable network pundits, where it's like, okay, this is what I want to hear. It's what I want to hear. Now let's split here in the middle. So I take the opportunities when I can. I feel that they have our back here. I've never been told not to talk about it. But I don't think that's true everywhere. I think, there are people who have worked in television who have told me they've been discouraged, especially in certain parts of the country, of talking about this. There's actually a story, I think it was in the New York Times, about a previous Boston meteorologist who went to, I think it was maybe a plains, somewhere in the plains, and they said, yes, we want you to talk about climate change. I think it was in Des Moines. Talk about climate change, blah, blah, when they hired him. And then he started doing it. People started complaining, and they sat him down and they were like, you need to stop doing this. And long story short, again, I think you can find this in the New York Times. He ended up, either he quit or they fired him. There was something down there, and it was because the viewers were acting well. I have never had that here. If we get negative feedback, which we will, it'll come down to, is there an inaccuracy? Is there wording that we shouldn't have used? So we do everything I can to not use any kind of loaded wording and do stories that are positive and negative. I did one not long ago, driving around the Portland area trying to use fast chargers, and some of them didn't work. And those are important stories to do, because otherwise you're just promoting something and you're not giving it the fair treatment. So I think if you're reasonable, people will generally be reasonable. I get some emails and messages that are not great, but luckily one of my skills that I think I was born with is I don't care that much. I mean, I want people to like me overall, but if there's some people that don't because of something I said that is true, then I can live with it. I'm not going to lose sleep. My coworker Dana's behind me. She's too far away. She had COVID recently, but she would agree with the sentiment that like it is what it is, right? Like it's just kind of one of those things you gotta deal with. And I think that's something that that's the hard part for some TV meteorologists. They want everyone to like them. And if you start talking about climate change, not everyone's gonna like you. So it might not be for everyone.
Well, you certainly do it well, and you keep the tone so light and so fun, even when the topic is seriously, and you clearly take the topic seriously. And I wonder if that's one of those like things you think about, or whether it comes naturally at this point.
Well, I don't think I'm a very serious person to begin with, so I think that part comes off naturally. But I think I did learn, one of my parts of my presentation was about doom and gloom. I did learn that people, I don't want to hear that. There's enough of that. I mean, like, we have a little cabin that we go to, and you can get Wi-Fi there, like it's available, and I refuse, and it's because I sometimes just don't want to know. And so I get that. I mean, I work in a newsroom, so I hear everything that comes through. So I think keeping it light, I think, is my personality. I'm not a super serious doom and gloom. Not a whole lot tends to worry me like in my day to day. And so, but I also think it's a change of pace for people, because a lot of climate reporting is pretty aggressive and is pretty doom and gloom. And that's another topic that I meant to touch on, is like talking to people about what it really means. Do I think that if we go +3 Celsius, that the human race is not going to live on this planet? No, like we can adapt to that. The problem here is the complicated and expensive infrastructure that we have built to grow the food necessary for the amount of people we have on the planet, where our roads are, where our cities are, all of this other stuff. It's very expensive. There will be loss of life, obviously, with extreme events. And so, in my opinion, it just pragmatically, it makes more sense to try to slow this down than it does to fix all our infrastructure. But even that, I've never heard that point conveyed too much. Like, I believe that our species can make it through this. We have a lot of technology, but what is it going to cost? What is it going to look like to do that?
You have such a you confront this on a daily basis, right? This is something that you think about and communicate out regularly. For the rest of us, I'm curious about, what advice you might have about looking for opportunities or forums to generate climate conversations in our day to day. And when we start opening up those conversations, do you have any tips about how to tell where people are on that scale that you showed at the beginning of, but there's a difference between a skeptic and a denier, but how do we tell where you are?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so I think it comes down to you're reading a person, right? So if you're good, if you're not if you're not great at that, it might be hard to do this. But I found a lot of it when it comes down to climate change is what's their initial tone when you talk about something. So electric vehicles are actually a pretty easy endpoint to see where people are at. There's quite a few people who are not ready for them, and I understand there's a lot of very justifiable reasons for that. But are they just saying, yeah, I'm not ready yet. I tow a boat, up to Aroostook County, and maybe in a couple of years I'll consider it. Or do they say, hey, do you know that they're mining cobalt, with children? So it's kind of that initial reaction to some things can tell you roughly where someone's at, in my opinion. So yeah, electric vehicles are one of those. There's someone I met that was saying, I said something, and they said something like, yeah, but the climate's always been changing. That to me is someone who it's like, they've got a little opinion, but I might be able to just sneak in there and be like, yeah, but we know that. So I think it's more about what's the initial reaction. If it's kind of an aggressive one with a really strong take on it, you're probably not going to have a lot of luck with that conversation. And if we're talking about like people you really know and relatives, that's a whole other can of worms because you value their relationship. And I have friends like that where like they're just never gonna see it this way, but I like them and it is what it is. I'm not gonna lose, friendships over something we disagree on that's not likely to come up in our day-to-day, in our day-to-day life. And so I think that has a lot to do with it too. What's your relationship? I think a lot of people are counting this with relatives. And that is a little trickier. But when I talk to people, what's their first baseline reaction to a relatively soft climate change related topic, heat pumps, electric vehicles? And if they're very against them, then you're probably going to have a bit of a hard time there.
You mentioned that, one of those responses might be something like, oh, the climate's always changing. And I'm curious about that, climate versus weather. Is that something that people really tell us the difference? Tell us whether people understand the difference and what can we do to help?
I don't think people do understand the difference. And I think sometimes it's communicated poorly. So an example would be, I have no doubt that we're going to continue this warming trend, in a 30-year span. But I try to tell people on TV a lot, like, okay, last winter wasn't a real winter. The winter before wasn't either. It makes sense to me that we would have a winter in here where we just get clobbered. Like, this is not that's the difference between weather and climate is like weather is we got a couple big storms, we had a few cold weeks, even a couple months of cold weathers is not, that should still happen. But what does it look like at that 30-year span, of a 60-year span? And that's climate. Weather is we had a 15-degree below zero day last winter, right? Or winter before. And so that's weather. And conversely, if you're going to take that stance, though, you have to be like that when it's hot weather too. To me, we had a really hot July. That happens. I mean, you have really hot Julys, but what is what's climate about it is, let's zoom out and look at the fact that they're all in the last 10 or 15 years, the top warmest July. So that's the difference. And I think you have to uniformly apply it. I've seen people, meteorologists or climate communicators, make the mistake of only harping on it. It's like, okay, there's a record high month because of climate change. Well, then inevitably, if you kick a La Nina year and you break off a piece of that polar vortex, you're going to have a cold February. Then what are you saying about that? So it really is supposed to be days are obviously weather, weeks are weather, months can be weather. Like I said, if we had a below average winter with a lot of snow, that wouldn't throw me off at all, because we're one finite point in this whole map.
Do you think that there will be, or are you already seeing tools or forecasts, things that help you and other meteorologists sort of message that weather reporting in the context of climate change, and what just some specific things, like, are there flood forecast messages, or are there, you mentioned that stretch of really hot weather in July. We know there are a lot of folks who need access to cooling shelters. Like, how much do those sort of alerts start to become a part of the core weather report?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actually a whole group. I think it's called Climate Central Climate Matters, where they send out graphics to TV meteorologists that can help them tell a story about climate change in their market. I tend to not really use them because I usually know, but they'll say, if you weren't paying attention, they'd send a thing, hey, this is the second warmest July. Here are all the Julys plotted from the early 1900s. And so if nothing else, it puts a little like bug in your ear that maybe you could talk about it later. But I think you touched upon something that's some of the most important proof we can have, and it unfortunately is starting to happen, which is people seeing it. I mean, after those January storms that were like all rain, huge flooding without big wind. I mean, there are record flood in Portland. I was standing out there and my hair was barely moving. So we can reach an all-time flood record just by having a storm offshore because our tide is so high. People notice that, and so those little things do move the needle, even if people don't want to talk about it. And so, unfortunately, it comes with damage too. A lot of places are still rebuilding from those storms. But I do think, unfortunately, there is a value to, or not value, but there is it's a reality to it. Of okay, we're not just talking about what could happen now. We have windstorms all the time now, and they're routinely knocking trees out, causing big flooding. So what is it going to look like for us? I've always been worried about this. What is a true category 1 hurricane look like for Maine right now? I mean, if we gust into the 60s, we have like 400,000 people without power. So sustained 74 miles an hour or higher, that's what a true Cat 1 is. I mean, it would be disaster. So what people seeing little increments of it hopefully make them realize it's a real thing, rather than just having to look at charts and stuff nobody really wants to look at.
Well, and this is where it starts to be, you're not letting people know just, do I need to bring the umbrella with me when I head out in the morning, right? You're offering life-saving information.
Yeah, and I think sometimes you're reminded of that responsibility. When I was covering weather on a national scale, I remember that a lot because of tornadoes. I would be sent to a lot of tornado aftermath, and they were usually the bigger tornadoes. They didn't really send us for the small ones. And it was a reminder that our job isn't just to entertain and wear makeup. It really is, supposed to be life-saving. Luckily, we have long stretches of weather where this is one of them. But ultimately, our main goal is to make sure people are informed enough that no one gets hurt. And even in a snowstorm, I don't like to tell people what to do. That was something my first chief meteorologist in my first job said. Most of these viewers are adults. Tell them what the conditions are going to be like. and they can decide what to do. So he told me, I don't want to hear you say, don't go out unless it's literally like a tornado on the ground. And that stuck with me a little bit. So you really won't hear me say that. But I will say, visibility is going to be under a quarter mile. It's going to be ripping snow. So most Mainers know that means probably you shouldn't do this. But so that's our main responsibility, whether it be in the short term or in the longer term. When you're talking about climate change, our main goal is safety and making sure people are prepared.
Are there, in the last few minutes, this is just a tiny little question. Talk to us about AI and weather forecasting, weather modeling. Are there tools that you're using that can, I know you said talking about the future is a dangerous game, but can AI make it less dangerous or is it way more?
No, I think it can help. There's already one of the major computer models, the European model, already has an AI version. So they run it separately and they're skill testing it to see if it's better than the original. Right now, it's not. Right now, the original is still doing well. But what it's going to do, right, it's going to learn. And it's going to learn from its mistakes. In the past, that was actually a manual job. So skill scores would be tracked. And then programmers would go in and say, okay, the European model at day 10 is too warm at certain temperatures, blah, blah. Let's tweak this variable and see how that plays. The AI model is verifying itself every time. And in theory, it should learn its own biases. And then I don't know what you need me for. So that's the thing, is like one of our best things a meteorologist can be is better than the model. And a lot of that is knowing their biases. We show one every day called the IBM graph that loves to clear storms out way faster than they're going to clear out. I know that, and we'll talk about that. And that's what the AI is going to try to do on a daily basis. So it'll be interesting. I do think it will help. The biggest limiter, believe it or not, two biggest limiters in weather forecasting, even though it's improved a lot, is computing power. Like there's so many variables in this that, as crazy as it seems, it takes still hours to run these computer models. Like you think back to before the Pentium 386 days, like these are taking time to run. And the other thing is just input. How much real world data can we put into the model? The denser that network is, the fewer gaps there are, and the more it will be right. Because we know how most of the atmosphere works. It's a matter of plugging in current and then using the thermodynamics, the dynamics models to project the future. But right now, computing power is an issue, and density of observations is an issue.
Keith, I can't even tell you how many questions we haven't gotten to yet. Thank you, everyone who has contributed questions. I wish that we could keep you all for the rest of the afternoon and just keep talking. Thank you so much, Keith, for sharing all of this. It is a fascinating job that you do every day, and it's such a joy to get to watch you do it in real time and to get this behind the scenes peek into something that we can all have a little bit of a piece of in our own climate communications.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having me, and I may regret this, but if you have any questions, you can email me. And it's do you going to send something out later, or do you just want to
We
send that
will,
out?
yeah.
Because you can actually find it deep enough on the internet if you want to anyways. But if you have a question that we didn't get to, shoot it to me, and if it's not too wacky, I'll try to get back to you.
Thank you for that. And thanks for the reminder to everyone. We'll get that follow-up email later this afternoon. Feel free to forward it around and definitely have rich and interesting conversations as you go out into the rest of the world. Come back next Friday and meet us in the same time and space. We have a really interesting program planned for next week about Dedaga Bimuk, which is the new contact center at the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. We are going to have a bunch of just really fascinating speakers with us. There will be a link to sign up for that program in today's follow-up email, and I cannot wait to see you then. Have a wonderful weekend, and thank you as always.
Thank you so much, Keith.